Live from the Boss and Roland headquarters in Los Angeles, I'm Brian Baggett for Musician's Friend Private Reserve Guitars, and on behalf of Musician's Friend and Boss Pedals, I'd like to welcome you to our live webinar. Today's topic is pedals and how to put your pedals in a logical order. One of the most common questions that we get is, how do I put my pedals in the right order to get the best tone possible? And now I'd like to introduce our special guest. This guy has played with Frank Zappa, David Lee Roth, even people that you wouldn't think he's played with. I've seen this guy on the Grammy Awards. So one of my favorite musicians, composers, and guitarists, the amazing Steve Vai. Steve, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Brian.
You're very welcome.
Very generous intro.
Well, thanks. So we're going to start with a typical pedal order. So what we have is a Boss pedal board here, and Steve is going to go through the pedal board, talk a little bit about the effects, and play through it, and just show you kind of maybe a typical pedal order, and then maybe any insight that you have on that, Steve. So
Sure, yeah. Well, the way I've experimented with having pedals set up through the years is sort of different than what might be considered conventional. And I would also like to add, we like to use the term best signal path or cleanest signal path. In reality, that, we can use that terminology, but really anything goes. When you're playing with pedals, it's like, don't be afraid to, there's no mistakes you could make, except run out of batteries in the middle of a show. That's not good. But you can put them in any order, and you can see how your ear responds to the difference of the orders, because it does have a definite effect on the overall sound. So with this pedal board, although it may be considered conventional setup, you can just swap this stuff around to see how it changes. Now I can give you my kind of overview on what I might consider normal or not. But anyway, we got the signal coming out of the guitar. So whenever I say out, I'm referring to out of the guitar as opposed to out of the front of the amp, because a lot of times that gets kind of mixed up. So now the signal coming out of your guitar is really like a flat line level signal, unless you have some kind of boosters or something in your guitar. So you got it coming in here, and then it goes through all the effects this way, and then comes out here and goes to the amp. Now this is probably one of the most important pieces of gear in your pedal board. It's a tuner. And one of the things I really like about these tuners, you see the little, you hit a note, and you can tune it until it kind of locks and it goes up, there's the note, which is really quite cool. And it also can act as a mute, because then when you click it in, you got it now. So this is a very just straight, dry, clean signal into my rig, which is my legacy amplifiers. So now the way that this is set up, what I like to do, or what you can do, sometimes people like to have a clean tone and then they go into distortions. Now, whenever you go into a distortion with a clean tone, it's very different than having a dirty tone and going into a distortion. The distortion that you use when you're using a clean tone is a lot more animated, so to speak. The quality and the grit of the actual distortion is more pronounced when you have a clean tone and you're using it. And I'll give you an example here. It's a very clean tone, and this DS1 has been sort of like a workhorse in my entire career. I've used this pedal, and it's really hairy. It's a hairy pedal. And what I mean by that, it's so fantastic. If you do have a clean tone, you just crank that distortion all the way up and crank the tone down, and you can actually get a kind of a decent kind of a distortion. And you'll notice if I go to this other one, which is the OD1X, this is introduced last year, but right? This one was last year. Okay. Now this is a digital distortion pedal as opposed to more of an analog pedal. So the extra advantages you get are more control over the EQ. But as a drive pedal, now watch, this is the same kind of clean tone, jam drive, but it's a completely different. As opposed to. And you know, with this is completely different. But now if you have more of a distorted tone on the amplifier, this is my sort of dirty channel, which is normally what I use. I usually use more of a distorted tone into the pedals as opposed to, and I use the drives as sort of a kick up for certain solos and melodies, as opposed to a clean tone with a distortion.
But the distortion pedal, it comes first. The guitar, then the distortion pedal, then the amp, right?
Not necessarily,
So
not in my
sometimes
rig.
you're running that through the loop?
Well, no, never.
Okay.
When he says loop, he's referring to the send and return in the back of the amp, which we're gonna get to
Right.
later. But I never do that because it really sounds bad.
Right.
It sounds like it just sounds like hell. You know, it's like an ice pick in the forehead.
Sure.
You don't like that, Brian. We don't want that.
Where have I heard that before?
Anyway, exactly. But then again, it's not off limits, you know, to put a distortion in the loop of the back of the amp. It just doesn't, you know, for me, it's not that's the sound I like. Okay. So most of the time I have a distorted. Hang on, let me just change tweak the amp a little bit. Okay. So this is. And then what I do is, if I'm going to use a DS1, then I pull that way back, that distortion, because I don't need so much. I just need a. See how it just adds a little. And now if I go to this drive here now with the distortion and I bring that back a bit. See, this responds really nice to distortion that's already existing. Matter of fact, I prefer this over this when it comes to hitting the existing distortion because it's just there's something smoother about it. It sings a little more. You hear how that sounds kind of choked a bit? See how that's. Totally different.
And I think that's a really important thing to mention, that, you know, we can use distortion pedals as our primary distortion, but we can also use them as a boost to our already
and
dirty amplifier.
And that's what I do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great way to use a distortion pedal, but that's two functions of a distortion
and I would use
pedal.
2 distortion pedals. I would always have 2. As a matter of fact, some time ago I developed a distortion pedal that had 2 distortions, and one was it was made specifically for a clean channel, which I would say this.
Yeah, I agree. Like that, the DS1 sounds better with the clean amp.
Yeah, because you go clean, and then you crank that. And
Right.
It's nice.
It is.
You know.
then that one excels with the dirty amp.
And that's good with the dirty amp,
Yeah.
but you got to crank you got to find the sweet spot for
Absolutely.
you.
Yes.
Okay, so then you move on into these other devices. Now, I would tell you, this is the delay. So when you get this delay on, you get this in your clean channel, and you can fool around with all of these parameters of the delay, which gives you more delay, longer delay time, more feedback, which means the amount of repeats. You know, we could sit here all day and talk about parameters, but so it just adds a nice little. Now, the only problem that I ever have with putting the delay at the end of the signal here and through the front, which I very rarely do, never do actually, is use the delay out in front of the guitar. It always goes in the loop, which we'll see later. But as a conventional setup, the way this is now, and where the delay is now, you'll notice that if you hit your distortion, your distorted guitar signal is going to hit this delay. And it's going to change dramatically the sound of the delay, because the delay responds to the energy that's hitting it. For instance, you see, you hear a lot of delay here when I turn the volume up. But if I bring the volume down, it actually hits the delay softer and you get less delay. So if you hit a distortion pedal and then you hit the delay, you're going to be distorting and adding a lot more signal to the delays. So and now what you might notice also is as I'm playing, you're not hearing any delay. Or very little compared to when you stop playing. So I would normally put the delay in front of, if I was going to put it on the floor, in front of the distortions, because then you're getting a clean signal hitting the distortions. And it's nice to experiment with the position that you put your phase shifter and your flanger. Now, a flanger, you might or might not know, is more of I kind of consider it a very tight chorus, because things like pitch shift, chorus, flanging, they do similar kinds of things to the signal, but with slightly different parameters, and that's what gives it the different sounds, like the flanger. A flanger always sounds like this. You know, it's kind of like a... Where a phase shifter is more like a... Give a little more depth, speed it up a little bit. So when fooling around with the kinds of position of these pedals, although this might be conventional, you can consider, well, what would it sound like if I took the delayed signal and sent it into the flange and then phased the delay flange signal, as opposed to the way it is now, which you're flanging the signal and then phase shifting a flange signal and then sending that into a delay. Or you can go with the phase first, and then you're phase shifting a signal and then flanging a phased signal. So it sounds like nomenclature, but it's actually Billy Clutcher. No, what it is slight variations in the sounds overall. So I highly recommend experimenting with the position, experimenting with how the sound hits the signals when you're putting the distortion before or after, or the delays here. Although this is conventional setup, as they say, there's no rules really. I wouldn't do this normally, but I guess I'm not the norm.
And another thing that's interesting, I think, is that, and we talked about this a little bit before the broadcast, is that, you know, some of our guitar heroes, some of them didn't even have distortion pedals. They were just using their Marshalls.
Right.
So the phaser would be post or pre-gain.
Yeah.
Right. So the phaser before the distortion to get, you know, that classic tone. If, you know, Hendrix,
Yeah.
Edward Van Halen, you know, he used that phaser before the gain. So that's my personal preference, would be to put the phaser before the distortion pedals as well.
Well,
So-
also, yeah, and there's also some kind of it always sounds different to me when you don't have a lot of pedals and you're just going direct into an amplifier and you just have like one pedal. I mean, I
Yeah.
saw Jeff Beck play, he had one pedal.
Yeah.
And he gets more color out of his guitar tone than anybody could believe, you know, is possible.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because I was thinking too, I'd seen your drawer of pedals at your studio,
Yeah.
and I would assume that the way you use pedals in the studio is way different than you do live. You might hear a specific effect in your head for a song and go just grab that one pedal out of the drawer and run it in the signal path for that one track.
Well,
of guitar.
that's absolutely. But one thing I can hip you to that you may want to experiment with, and this might open up a Pandora's box for you. But what I do a lot with those pedals is I'll take the output of my guitar and I'll split it into multiple outputs. So from one output here, instead of having one going here, I'll have four. One will go into one effect and then into one amp that will be mic'd a particular way. Another goes into another completely different effect, into a completely different amp that's, you know, mic'd differently, et cetera, et cetera. And then if you can keep your phasing in line, you can create these beautiful tapestries of stereo sounds, where maybe pan to the hard left side would be a distorted guitar going through a flanger and a high-gained Marshall. To the right, you might have a really clean Fender with a flanger on it, and then in the middle, you can use a direct signal that's delayed a little bit. So it's endless what you can do if you start splitting the signal. So a lot of the effects that you see in the draw at my studio are me fooling around in the studio. And yes, I wouldn't do that live. I don't have enough money to pull that stuff around the world.
Sure, well, but also you don't necessarily have to have them all in the signal chain, you know, and you can say, well, I hear this specific effect on this part of
Right.
this song, so I
Sure,
just grab
yeah.
that, throw it in there, and record it. you
Yeah,
know.
and I love collecting pedals.
Me
They're-
too.
They're just fun,
They
kind
are.
of colorful things. And the people that make various kinds of pedals through the years, it's sort of like customizing your motorcycle, or you know, coloring your I don't know, doing like a piece of art. They just love getting really animated and funny. I collect hot sauces. Because the
that's the
people
big thing.
Yeah, the people that make the labels are so funny, you know, and that's one of the charms in collecting pedals. And they're all kind of different, you know, they all have a different quality, different sound, and different things. And I've got pedals that do all sorts of bizarre things, but a lot of times they're good for, you know, one thing, and then I'll use it for a while, and I'll be like, oh, this is the new magic sauce. And then after a while, I'm like, all right, get this thing out of here.
Well, that's great. So that's our typical pedal setup.
Yeah.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to have Steve Vai's pedal board here, and he's going to talk us through that. Okay, we're back live with Steve Vai, and now we've got Steve Vai's pedal board here. And Steve, when I heard that you were going to be the special guest for the webinar, I was really excited about that, because not only are you an amazing player, but you're also a recording engineer and an overall just sound guru. So tell me a little bit about sort of your love affair with sound in addition to music.
Along with music itself, when I was younger, I discovered what sound-on-sound recording was. which was overdubbing,
Right.
I had this epiphany, and I just saw all of the possibilities of what it means to build sound. And then when I understood what a pan pot was, these are all beginning development stages when you're like, it's like, going, oh, this is what a whammy bar does, It was just so exciting, because you've got this stereo spectrum, and it's like real estate. You look at it like your backyard, and you use it to place sounds in, and you're creating sort of a tapestry, and you're decorating the audio real estate. And according to where you place things, that's going to determine the cleanliness or the sound or the look of your backyard, so to speak. And you've got a horizontal dimension, which is like the panning, and you've got a vertical dimension, which is the EQ. And I highly recommend any musician, any guitar player, just learning even the basics of what EQ is, what frequencies are, low frequencies, down at 50 cycles, 40 cycles, and what it sounds like when you pump a certain frequency, and what mid-range is, like 1 kilohertz, and then high-end on a guitar is like 4 kilohertz, 4K, and air is like 10K, 12K, and what it sounds like when you change these things. That's your vertical dimension. And when you're creating a sound mix or a guitar sound, people think, well, my guitar, I'm going to just pump a ton of bottom end on it and a lot of top end. But what happens then, you're competing frequencies with bass, and the sound of your band or your overall mix, is going to be compromised because you've got frequencies fighting each other, which is sort of like in your backyard, if you had a beautiful tree, and then you had another beautiful tree in back of it that was just a little smaller, you wouldn't see that other tree.
Right.
Or they would grow into each other, which is an effect. But if they're separated a bit, or if you make one a little lower or higher, you leave space in the stereo spectrum when you EQ your guitar properly with everything else that's going on in there. And this holds true for your band, your live sound, your mix of your record.
Yeah.
So highly recommend fooling around a bit with EQ and just getting a basic terminology understanding of it.
I think that analogy is so awesome, to think of EQ being vertical and then panning being horizontal. And I've never thought of it that way, but it's so true, and it's so important. And Steve,
I deliver.
You and I have a mutual friend in Dave Weiner.
Dave Weiner,
who's a good buddy of mine. And I was talking to him one time about his rig, and I was like, so are you running in stereo, Dave? He's like, no, Steve's in stereo. So I run mono. And that's kind of exactly what you're talking about. You can't. What's the use in having two guitars in stereo? If you run Dave in mono, you can move him around the stereo spectrum and get him sort of behind that big tree or out from behind that big tree. Whereas if he was stereo, you both would be kind of overloading the space.
Yeah.
Now, so one night on your Story of Light tour, Dave throws me up on stage with you for an impromptu jam, and one of the things...
You were that guy.
I was the guy, and one of the things that I remember most about that night was how great it sounded on stage.
Oh,
the
cool.
Steve Vai monitor mix is just unbelievable, and that's just another testament to how finely tuned your ear is. So...
Well, it's also just practical thinking, a lot of it, and reason being, I don't go direct. Like a lot of players these days are going directly into a piece of gear and then coming out and going into the monitor consoles.
Sure.
I still like the sound of speakers.
Yeah.
So what happens when you put a microphone in front of a speaker and then you put that signal through your monitor, it never really sounds as good as the cabinet itself. So what I have for monitors is a small stereo guitar cabinet that only has my guitar in it. So now then the other two monitor wedges have everything else. So this way it's clean. I'm not mixing and competing for frequencies in these two little speakers. So that's a cool thing to do too if you're the kind of player that what's coming out in back of you is not enough.
Right.
Just a little two-speaker stereo setup.
That's great, great. So here we have your pedal board, Steve.
Okay.
And so now we're going to get into a little bit more advanced concepts in terms of the signal path and what's happening. You're using the effects loop on your head.
Yeah.
So just go ahead and run us through your pedal board and
Sure.
talk about what's going on.
Okay, well, what you saw before was a guitar going into pedals, and then the output of the pedals going to the front of the amp. Very simple and very effective. But there's also another way that you can do things to even give even more dimension to the sound. And this is, well, it's relative, but this is the way I hear it. And that's by using the effects loop in the back of the amplifier. Most amplifiers these days have what's called a send and return. And what that does is the send comes after the preamp, which is the preamp is the part of the amplifier that has all the EQ and all the distortion and all that stuff, and it's line level basically. And then an amplifier, the gist of this, there's a preamp, and then there's an amplifier that takes the preamp sound and amplifies it. So whatever you send into the return of the head will then be amplified. So I take the send, which is right out of the preamp of the amplifier, and I go into, first and foremost, a volume pedal. And this is my Morley little alligator volume pedal, because what happens when you do that, whenever you change the volume now, you're actually just changing the level of the sound as opposed to bringing the volume down. Because when you bring the volume down in the front of an amplifier, you lose a lot of the gain and distort. You lose the tone. So when you do it this way, you're just changing the actual level. So right now I've got the total dry, clean sound. Whoops. Okay, so now what I do then, now remember this is coming from the send out of the back of the amplifier. And then it comes out here, and it goes into this super chorus, this boss, which the reason why I do this is because then it splits the signal into stereo. So you see I take a mono signal, and now I split it into stereo, and when you have a stereo chorus, now technically one side gets returned to the main head, and another side gets returned to another head. That's around here someplace.
It's underneath.
It's underneath. Okay, so that's the bottom head. So what you're getting out of these two cabinets is a stereo. So you're getting this as opposed to just this. So now another way to utilize this to make your sound even bigger, I come out of these outputs here and I go into these delays. Now, never mind that, that's a battle scar from my last show. Okay, so you go into these delay units. So now, for instance, this delay here is coming out of one side of the amplifier because it's only being returned here to one amplifier. Now you can set this delay many different ways with different speeds of delay and different amount of repeats and the intensity of the repeats. And this has always been, the DD7 has always been a real workhorse for me. It's so dependable. And it has two outputs, so you can actually create stereo outputs just with this one device. But I like having two. So here is the second output, and it goes into this side. I'm going to shut this side off. Now this is the delay that's coming out of the left side of the cabinets. So you see I can now add both of these. It's a little... I get really neurotic sometimes, like I can hear the difference between that and that. It's a curse, I tell you. Okay, anyway. So
That's
now
why you're here, Steve.
That's right. So you put them both on and you get very many combinations. You can hear the... And you can make them very loud, so you get... So what I like to do, the kind of sound I actually like to set up is with one delay, maybe a little faster than that. I mean, slower. And then the other one, even slower. That's a little too slow. And this is, if you ever seen some of those players that create loops of delays and then bend down and start playing with it, and it sounds like a spaceship. What they're doing is just changing the speed of the delay. Their secret is not safe anymore. Okay, so here, the kind of sound that I set up. Let me do this. So then when you hit these both, you get, and I kind of like that. It's like a bouncing, not quite even, so it creates a wash, you know. Even a little slower. Make that a little faster. Okay, so and then you can adjust the level. That's how my basic setup going, then returning back to the amplifier is. So that's the back end.
Sure, so if we could simplify your use of the effects loop, really with the CH1 there, you're basically using that as a stereo split.
It's being used as stereo split,
and you're not necessarily engaging the chorus.
Well, it's engaged now, because when you engage it and it's being used as a stereo split, you get that very nice stereo chorus as opposed to a mono chorus.
But sometimes you might have it off and just use it strictly as a stereo split.
Yeah.
And then by setting your DD7s slightly different, you sort of exploit the stereo effect of your
absolutely.
rig.
That'll definitely tell you, hey, I'm stereo.
Because if we had the same signal going through both speakers, we're dual mono without getting too complicated.
You're dual mono.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's the back end. Mm-hmm. Now, what you notice when you put delays, digital delays through the back end, you are getting an infinitely more cleaner delay than putting it through the front. Yeah. So that's why I always put them through the back. The older sound, the more 70s kind of analog delay sound is a very different kind of a sound. When you go through the back of the amp like this, you get a wash, a clean wash. When you use the front of the amp, and especially the new pedal that I'm going to discuss later, you get more of almost a muted, rounded delay that will gang up on itself when it's through the front of the amp. Okay, so then out of my guitar, it's very simple. I go into the wah-wah first because the signal coming out of the guitar, if you remember, is very clean. It's just a line signal. And by going into the wah-wah, then hitting the distortion pedal, it's very different than hitting the distortion pedal, then hitting the wah-wah. And without switching stuff around to show you that, you can experiment with that. It's a whole different beast. That's when you get that very compressed, as opposed to like the wah-wah that I'm going to show you now. Okay, so my setup basically, this is a Ibanez distortion Gemini that I designed, and I made this because I was looking for a distortion pedal that I could use on a clean tone, which is, you know, how the DS1 is so good at that. I wanted that. So when I engage this, still sings nicely.
Sounds
You know,
great.
it's kind of a nice little. But if I now that's coming from a totally clean sound, and also this level is an actual level. If you notice, if I turn it down, you don't lose anything. If I turn the level up, it's the same tone.
Yeah.
It's just louder.
Right.
Now that's pedals usually don't do that. They change the gain structure when you change the level. So now if this is more set up like one of those old Ibanez tube screamers, which when we were looking at the two different pedals before,
Yeah.
one of them was the older one that you guys released a year ago. That would be more associated with what this pedal would do, and the DS one would be more associated with this pedal. So when I'm in my normal kind of distortion channel, I don't know if you hear the difference in the delay from the quality of the delay when you're going in front. It's always there.
We're also stereo.
We're
but yeah,
stereo.
the quality of the delay.
The quality of the delay, it's not getting choked. See, it's all there. So that's the normal kind of distorted tone that I use. And then the way I set this pedal is, which is the way I set the other one before, which is just a little distortion, just to kind of kick in a,
It's like a boost.
it's like a boost. Now also you notice that with the wah-wah in this position, you get a real because you're taking a clean signal, which is out of the guitar, and then distorting it. If the distortion was first in front of the wah-wah, it would be very different.
Sure.
You wouldn't have nearly that much presence and energy. I got a lot of delay on there right now. I usually don't use that much. But you see, if I was to go and use this side with the distorted amp, it'd be too much. Well, at this
hear it
level,
there.
at this level, it's not too much. But you know,
Sure.
when I'm gangbusters, it's like, you know, Yucca Flats after the blast.
No doubt. No. Well, that's a great concept, using two distortions, one as a boost, one as the main distorted tone. I think
Yeah,
that's a
I
great
mean, they're
concept.
very different sounds. I mean, if you know,
Absolutely.
this is like just a quick demonstration of the distorted amp with a little distortion. And then a clean amp with the heavy distortion. Very different kind of a.
It's great. Man, yeah,
There it
it
is.
sounds great. I've got the best seat in the world right now. Swimming in your guitar tone is awesome. So we're going to take a quick break now, and when we come back,
setups and these cool Boss pedals, and I'm noticing here that they have some new pedals out, which is the Wazacraft, very cool pedals, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those. Just a quick overview of this setup. We've been through a couple of setups. One of them was coming out of the guitar, going through the effects, and then into the rig. And then there was the setup of mine that was actually coming from the send of the back of the amp, going through some effects, and then going back. Well, this is sort of a hybrid. This is from the send out of the back of the amp, going into the chorus, which is splitting the tone, splitting the signal. And then the stereo signal, one is going into this DM2, and another is going into this DM2, and they're returning, and you'll hear this one. That's one delay, and this is the other. So when you put them together, you get... And that's the kind of sound that I like as far as repeats. Now, the cool thing about this pedal is it's reflective of the earlier pedals. That was this model, basically. And by the way, if I'm wrong about any of this, don't be afraid to come in and tell me, because it's better that I get corrected than to give people the wrong information. But there's a sound quality that a lot of people enjoy that is part of the old analog sound, and many delay pedals. Well, there was before digital, so the delay pedals were analog, and they had this kind of quality to them that was soft. It was, when I say soft, I mean EQ-wise, and there was this warmth to them, and you can hear it in this pedal. You hear how the signal kind of, it's warmer, and as it decays, it actually becomes a little more friendly, and as opposed to the digital delays, which are just complete representations of the sound you just played, clear over and over again. This actually has a totally different color. It's a little more friendly. It's a little more of a bass sound as opposed to a cloud sound. It's more like the trees as opposed to the clouds, or the grass, actually. So when you get these two together, it's not, if you remember before when I was using my rig, it was a wash. A lot of this is very different. It's more, like I say, friendlier. And then you got a little chorus, and you got the... Oh, there's the chorus. So that's, if you take these pedals and you go through the front of the amp, it's going to be a very different sound. It'll sound a little more grainy, a little more ganged up on. Okay, so one of the cool things about this new Wazacraft, which is modeled after the one that they had in the 80s, this switch right here will double the delay time that you have. It's a custom switch. Once you kick that in, see if I bring this over to this side, you'll hear. See, the timing was cut in half. So by doing this now, on these new and improved versions, you get a whole another delay speed. Okay, so now moving along, these two are similar in that they were introduced before. But these are the brand new ones.
Well, they're current pedals, but they're modded.
They're current pedals, that's right. Okay, I got it. I remember now. Okay. They're current pedals, except they have this mod switch, which actually adds a different dimension. Now, what I was showing you guys before, the difference between like the DS1 and the other pedal, one is really good and a clean sound. The other sounds a little more appropriate during being used in a dirty sound. These are kind of similar. The Blues Driver pedal is kind of, let me just bring some of this One thing I want to mention also that a lot of young players who are getting into pedals should know, and this is one of these crazy anomalies about manufacturers, is that they name things differently, but they mean the same in different pedals. So with delay pedals, you have delay, you have the amount of delay, which is the volume of the delay, the time, the delay time, and you have the amount of repeats. Sometimes it's called intensity, the amount of repeats. Sometimes it's called feedback. There's various terminologies. Don't be intimidated by them. Don't think that every different kind of pedal you use, if it says drive or gain, it's going to mean something really different. Usually it doesn't. So experiment and just get an overall idea in your head what the repeat means, the feedback, and the different terminology that it's used. But there's really only a few different things. The volume of the delay, the amount of repeats, and the timing of the delay. It'll be called many different things. Anyway, okay, so back to this. This blues driver is kind of a really nice pedal when you have a clean tone. Sorry, I'll just turn that off for now. So that's like hairy, and having a direct signal going into a distortion pedal will do that. It all of a sudden becomes very bright, very present. And with this, the thing I like about this blues driver is it's not going to give you that really heavy, sustained distortion that you get out of the DS1 when you crank the gain. See, that's very different if you remember what that other one sounded like. I'm going to turn the tone down a little bit because it's a little ripping my head off. But one of the coolest thing actually about the new Wazacraft units here is this custom mod. And if you notice, what it does is it actually adds a little more gain and fattens the sound up a bit. Now, one good way, one thing that I do, and I'm really trying to hear what a mod is doing, is you just hit the strings very softly and you fool around with it. Because sometimes if you crank it up and you play and then you go back and you fool around, you click it and you go to play again, you can't quite tell as easily what the mod is doing. So you can hear it a little better here. See, it's a little more bottom. As opposed to So it's got a much more crunchier kind of a vibe to it. So now, if I was going to use the dirty channel, if I was going to use this blues driver, I'd really have to crank that back because it would be just too heavy. Let me get some of this. Okay, so now this pedal is going to really sing with the distortion channel. So usually I'd probably keep the drive about there. And you hear the difference in that? As opposed to now with this modification on the new Wazacraft pedal, it's going to give you the same kind of modification that's on this, but in the colors of this pedal, which would be a little more sustain, a little more distortion, and a little more bottom end, a little fatter. It's harder to hear it from your point of view than when you're actually playing it and you're feeling how it sounds differently. Anyway, okay, so that's the, and you can hear the difference when. That's with the whole 9 yards. And that's basically the new pedals, the customization of them, which adds another whole dimension, and that's why they're so cool. And by the way, this is the first time that they've put this logo on the pedal. And what Wazacraft means, actually, is it's sort of like the flow of art and technique, which is very important because art, maybe the inspiration behind something, is very important, but the technique is important too because the two need to merge together in order to make the best creative statement. You know, that's the age-old dilemma that people feel that you can practice and practice and practice, even doing something for 10,000 hours and become very technically proficient, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a master or an effective artist, really, because you need that other dimension of inspiration. And that has nothing to do with technique. It has to do with an arising of an inner idea or inspiration that then can be expressed through the use of technique. You know, so that's kind of maybe what these pedals would be considered, the name. So there it is, and I'm very happy to be able to come down and give you a little demonstration of these pedals. I've always, like I say, you know, pedals for a guitar player are like exciting little toys. And I never get tired of them. And I love when these guys come up with new ones. I'm always happy to check them out and use them whenever I can. And I highly recommend exploring all these pedals that are available. I mean, right now, you know, Roland alone has 45. Is that right? 45? That's amazing. And one of the cool things about using pedals is it can inspire you to write something or play something that you may not normally do with just a clean sound. But the most important thing is that you're exercising your creative impulse without any obstructions. And what I mean by obstructions are mental obstructions that well, this guy doesn't use these pedals, so I shouldn't use them, or this guy uses these pedals, so I should use those pedals, or this guy plays like this, so I should play like that. That's all okay. It can be a start, but really, it's the vital thing is that you find your note, your own note. So anything goes, really. Conventional orders mean nothing. They can give you a start, but you might find a combination of things that responds to your inner note. And that is okay. Matter of fact, that's preferable. So with the plethora of pedals that are available, there's a lot of ways to twang your note. And there you have it. I'm Steve Vai, and it's very nice to be here with Roland. Thank you.
So the Waza craft pedals, and these are great pedals. They're modded by Boss, the inventors of the pedals. There's a lot of modded pedals out there. What a great idea to have the inventors mod the pedal for us. So very cool pedals. Now it's time to answer some of your questions. So I've got a couple questions for you here, Steve. Let's see. The first one is, what is Steve's favorite Boss pedal?
Oh boy. I like the DS1. It's kind of one that I always have with me because it is pretty versatile. But it's hard to say because if I had to make a choice, it would probably be the delay, which is it's the 6 or the 6 or the 7, the 7.
DD7.
The D7, yeah. You have to, when it comes to gear, I never understand why they name things with numbers and letters. I mean, if they called it Bob, I would remember.
We were trying to figure out what the M stood for on the new Waza Craft delay pedal, and we don't know. Here's another question that we have for you. What scale do you play the most, and how long do you practice your practice routine? I'm assuming in terms of hours or minutes.
Well, probably the tonality that comes out of my fingers more than any other is the Dorian, because that's more blues and minor,
right?
But
kind of a soft minor.
It's a soft minor.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a good way of putting it, actually. But my practice regime, I don't really have one, like a regimented. I used to be very, very rigid and regimented when I was younger, and that served a good purpose back when I was younger, to be very regimented with the structure of my practicing. It's not necessary, but it was necessary for me because I wasn't a natural guitar player. I had to work really hard at it, and plus I liked it. I really enjoyed it. So these days what I do is I look for ideas, and then I expand upon the idea. I kind of like meditate on the idea. So to give you an example, if I was gonna, I like to sit for at least an hour a night before I go to bed. Shut off the TV, shut off the internet, shut down the studio, and just go in the room and just play.
Nice.
Even if I'm playing all day recording, there's something to be said about leaving a specific amount of time every day for just playing and not thinking. That's really important. The two things that are vitally important that I try to do in that period, and this is something that when I'm improvising usually creates for the best improvisation. Those two things are, and you can try this, is to not think, which means the voice in your head that's always talking, and always criticizing yourself. You just kind of try to shut it off. And the way you do that is you pay attention to what you're doing. Paying attention to what you're doing does not mean you're thinking about what you're doing. You're actually being an observer of what you're doing. You can call it being present or being in the moment of what you're doing.
Yes.
Because what you're doing is happening right now. When you're thinking, you're not in the present moment, So not thinking means just being with your instrument. And the second thing, which usually aids the first thing, is not criticizing.
Yeah.
Okay? Because usually the little voice that's in your head is always criticizing something or judging something. Not even when you're playing the guitar, just in normal life. We're always criticizing and just stacking up and seeing how things, what they are. You don't really know what it is. But when you're playing, it's not uncommon to choke your own creative potential by criticizing yourself. Right. Like, oh, that's not good enough, or oh, I suck, or is the guy I'm playing with, is he better than me, or am I better than him? Does he have that riff? But this is all mine. This is what I mean by stilling that. So can you find a way to play and not judge yourself? It's hard because the ego is constantly in fear of being ratted out, you know. So we're always thinking when we're playing, there's this element of fear a lot of times, and it's really just self-judgment.
You know, I got an idea out of a book one time, a way to trick the ego, and that was, the author said, try to write a bad song. Try to write the worst song possible. Guess what comes out? Something pretty good. Because you've tricked the ego in a way.
Yeah, that's so. Another good way to trick the ego is to, when you go to write a song, if I was to tell you that your song is destined to fail, it's destined to be a complete, off of the radar. No one's ever going to know it, or they may not even ever like it, and it's just not going to be heard. How would that make you feel? You know, a lot of people, a response to that might be, well, then why play? Why write? Why should I write it? And one answer to that would be, then don't. But another perspective is when you lose the expectation, it actually creates an opening to do whatever you want.
Absolutely.
Because now you can say, well, if it doesn't matter what I do, if it doesn't matter to the world, what do I really want to do? Like, what would you do in life if you didn't have to get a job, if you didn't need a job, you know, or if you could write any music because whatever it is, it's going to fail. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, I do.
What'll happen is, if you find an enthusiasm for a particular type of music that's within you, that's the ticket. That is the sweet spot. The sweet spot is finding an enthusiastic idea and then going, okay, well then I'll do this, and then you create something, and usually, not usually, but, well, maybe usually, that enthusiasm flows, if you are enthusiastic and enjoying the process, it flows into the work, and it has a unique quality to it. It has your unique stamp on it. And usually those are the things you're most successful at, as opposed to trying to second guess what everybody wants to hear. Yeah. Never works.
No, it doesn't.
Never works, because you're competing with people who are doing what's natural to them.
Not only that, but you're guessing what they want to hear.
You're guessing, and you're not being yourself, and you're spending time not exercising your potential, which later you will regret, and even if you're successful at it, you will despise what it is that you did that was not beautiful and natural to you. Take it from me. Okay, so anyway, your question was...
Now that was the question, and you know, I think you answered it very well, and I think we got into some pretty deep stuff there, Steve.
I can't help it,
You know,
I apologize.
That's good stuff for all of us as musicians, to try to get out of the way and let the music flow. You know, don't force it, but also don't hold it in. If you feel like playing something, play it.
Yeah, and it can be tricky, because it's easy to say be yourself, but a lot of people don't really understand what that means.
Yes, you have to, absolutely.
But to answer your question very quickly, sorry, because this might be very useful too, in finding those little unique things that are within you. And this is what I do. You ask, what's my regime? My regime is to sit there and play without thinking and without criticizing what I'm doing, by saying that's as good as somebody, or it's not quite as good as, or whatever, and looking for interesting ideas and then meditating on them. And what I mean by that is I keep my attention on the idea and I work it. Like, for instance, if you sit and you only play, or if you play on one string, you know, you create a limitation. So if I was to sit for an hour and play on just one string,
Yeah.
there's stuff that's going to come out that then I've never done before, and then I'll work on it. Like I don't know how much time we have, but okay. One example right there. Kind of a simple little riff. Now, if I just kept doing that, right, that's some. So me sitting in my room now will do a bunch of that. So I've never done that. Maybe somebody else has done it, but I've never heard it. And that I've just discovered a little something within a minute that if I keep working on and keep working on, it's going to evolve into some. It's a phrasing. So that's what I work on is phrasing.
And it's limiting. It's a limitation as well. And
but you don't hear it as such when it just comes out.
One of my favorite jazz guitar players who we just lost recently was Jim Hall, and he took that to the extreme. He would have a guitar that he would only have 2 strings on it, and he would change which strings were on it so that he would just play on those 2 strings. And
that's great.
It's a great idea because then you're not tempted to move to the other strings because there are none.
Yeah.
So,
but getting into that meditative state of mind of being completely focused, and every time you feel your mind running out into past, future, or something else, you bring it back, and it's a very relaxed state. It shouldn't take. It doesn't take any struggle. It's actually pure relaxation, and that's the fun. That's really that's always been since day one, for me. The reason I play the guitar, and to this day is the same. Nothing has changed. Everything in my career has come to me as a result of that one thing, which is. Boy, this is fun.
Yeah, the fundamental,
Yeah.
right? Those were great questions, and thank you for the questions. Thank you for chatting. So, Steve, thank you so much for joining me today on this webinar.
Thank you, Brian.
You know, thanks for sharing your knowledge and your time with us. I've learned a lot. I'm sure everybody learned a lot, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely, man.
All right, enjoy.
I'm Brian Baggett for Musician's Friend Private Reserve Guitars, and on behalf of Boss and Musician's Friend, I'd like to thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.